students. All right, yesterday we began our discussion of land plants by summarizing the 6 requirements that land plants need to fulfill in order to be appropriately adapted to life on the land. If you need to review yesterday's information, feel free. Otherwise, we'll plow ahead with today's topic, which is also about land plants all week. But today we're going to be starting our discussion of 2 kinds of land plants, 2 different categories, if you will, of land plants. So let's begin. Make sure your books are open and you are copying this in your notes at this time. And we're going to begin today with the first of 2 kinds of land plants called non-vascular or primitive land plants. Now, we'll get to that term vascular in a moment, but let's just look at that word primitive here real quick. The word primitive in this context simply means simple. Primitive means simple. So these primitive land plants are those that have simple structures. And by simple, I simply mean that they're not very complex. They're not very complicated. Next week, we're going to be discovering how flowering plants and cone-bearing plants are pretty complex compared to these plants of this week. But non-vascular, primitive plants have very simple structures. And I think this is actually a picture of some moss growing on cow manure, possibly. Maybe the last topic, you remember the release of those spores and that video about the exploding spores from. All right, let's not go there. All right, it's kind of a stinky topic. So let's move on to the next characteristic of non-vascular or primitive land plants. These kinds of plants must live in moist areas. They're kind of a transitional type of plant between the really primitive plants in the last topic and the flowering plants of the next topic. These must live in moist areas because, well, they have simple structures, so they haven't really fully developed ways of dispersing their reproductive cells quite yet. And they don't have a great capacity to hold on to the water within their bodies, so they can't retain a lot of water. They can't prevent a lot of excess water loss. So many of these primitive non-vascular plants live in moist areas, and you can see this moss growing between the cracks of this rock wall. And I have a question for you. Why do you think the moss is growing in the cracks of these rocks? All right, maybe you said because it is within the cracks that the water accumulates. Water gets stuck in the cracks, so they're more moist areas. That would be a good answer. All right, another characteristic of these non-vascular plants is that they have the capacity, the ability to absorb water through all of their body parts. And we'll see how that differs from the second group of land plants a little bit later on. So they can absorb water through all of their body parts. That makes them have a great ability to live in those moist areas. They don't have to have specialized structures because if they live in those moist areas, they've got the water readily available. So it's a great characteristic to have if you're living in a moist area like these little plants here. Again, another type of a moss growing there. All right, look at that. Some examples of non-vascular or primitive plants include what I've mentioned here, mosses. Mosses are probably the ones most familiar to you. I'm sure you've seen moss growing in the woods, on old trees, on rocks, maybe in your backyard, under the steps, wherever. Mosses are very prevalent, non-vascular primitive plants, but there are other types as well. Liverworts, not liverwurst, liverworts. Liverworts, that's what these are. And hornworts. Hornworts. Liverworts and hornworts. Great names for these non-vascular primitive plants. So keep in mind we've got several examples here. And I want to give you with this next slide some human uses of these primitive plants. Some of you may be thinking, big whoop-de-doo. I don't eat moss for dinner, so who really cares about that? I'd rather have an apple or a banana. We'll get to those fruit later on. But humans around the world do use these kinds of plants for different reasons, including in a lot of parts of the world, they don't have trees growing that can be chopped down for firewood or fuel. Some primitive cultures in the world, in the past, historically, and even today, use some of these primitive land plants for fuel. That's right. They harvest them by ripping them out of the ground, let them sit out in the sun to dry out, and they actually have a lot of heat capacity. They can be burned for heating and for cooking, believe it or not. And here's something else that I find rather interesting. If you have ever spent any time outdoors and if you've ever seen moss, like sphagnum moss, growing on something, maybe you've taken your hand over that moss if you're curious, and you have felt how soft that moss can be. Maybe some of you that might have a little bit of a destructive bent in you, maybe you've ripped up some of that sphagnum moss and you've squeezed it and noticed that it's like a sponge, and lots of water can be squeezed out of that moss. It's because it's highly absorbent. In fact, if any of you are gardeners, if you like to grow gardens, a great soil amendment, something that you add to your soil, can be dried sphagnum moss or peat moss. And you can buy it at the store. And you can throw shovelfuls of peat moss, dried peat moss, into your garden soil. And when it rains, that peat moss acts like a sponge. And that sponge holds on to that moisture so that the other plants that you're growing can draw upon that stored moisture and obtain it through their roots. But check this out. People have known for a long time that sphagnum moss is soft and absorbent, because even in our continents past, some of the native people used to use, and again, some primitive cultures around the world use this too. And again, I use the word primitive to refer to simple technology, simple techniques, a simple way of keeping your babies soft and dry. Maybe you're going for a long journey and you're carrying that little one in a papoose. Well, if you've got some dried moss, you can wrap that around your baby's bottom and front and wrap them in cloths and carry them for a long journey. And even if they wet themselves, they won't wet you, because the moss will absorb the moisture that your little one is releasing, which is inevitable. Now, I don't know how moss might compare to big names like Pampers or Huggies and the like, but people have been using diapers for a long time with their babies. So enough said about non-vascular primitive plants. I just think that's kind of a cool use for moss. All right, let's get into our second group or our second kind or type of land plants called the vascular land plants. And that brings us to the question that I alluded earlier. What is non-vascular? Well, non-vascular implies that it doesn't have vascular whatever that might be. And now I'm talking about the second type, or vascular plants. Well, it kind of begs the question, what does vascular mean? Well, maybe some of you remember learning in health class about the cardiovascular system of the human body. If not, we'll learn a little bit about it later this year. But the vascular system in your body has to do with your veins and arteries, your blood vessels. Now, plants don't have blood, don't get me wrong, but vascular plants do have a type of vessel coursing within them that transports their lifeblood, so to speak. Not literally. If you cut a plant, it's not going to bleed blood like we do, but they will leak other substances like sap, which is like their lifeblood. So let's talk a little bit about this word vascular. First, vascular plants are land plants that have vascular tissue. Oh no, what the heck does that mean? You're not supposed to use a word in its own definition, folks. You all know that. So now we have to explain what vascular tissue is. If a vascular plant is a land plant with vascular tissue, well, what in the world is vascular tissue? I'll tell you. Vascular tissue is a system of tiny tubes. So just like the tubes in your body, the veins and arteries and capillaries, well, vascular plants have a system of tiny tubes. Now, they're not called veins and arteries. I'll let you know what they're called in just a moment here. But they have a system of tiny tubes, and those tiny tubes are used to transport materials, water, food, minerals, transport materials throughout the body of the plant. Again, one of the adaptations that vascular land plants have that enable them to be more hardy species. They can exist in a more varied type of environment. So let's talk about these types of vascular tissue. First one is called phloem. Look at the word. Phloem. That PH is pronounced like an F. So look at the word and say it with me. Phloem. Phloem. One more time. Phloem. Very good. So what is phloem? Well, phloem is the type of vascular tissue that transports food. And I'm going to move that over a little bit. Transports food through the plant. And the movement in phloem is both up and down. Now, you're going to have to remember the names of these vascular tissues, and I want to give you a little memory aid right now. And I'm going to ask you the question, what flows through phloem? Everybody? Food flows through phloem. Now, that's a tongue twister I'd like you to try. If I asked you the question, what flows through phloem? You can all respond. Food flows through phloem. Food flows through phloem. Food flows through phloem. Let's see who can say it 3 times real fast after I ask you the question, what flows through phloem? All right, perhaps you were challenged by that tongue twister, but merely trying that tongue twister may help you remember what flows through phloem. It's food. Food flows through phloem. Whew. And it does go up and down for some good reasons. As we will learn, food is produced in the leaves of plants, and that food goes downward into the roots to be stored and upwards to increase the growth of the plant taller and taller throughout the stem, which we'll learn about tomorrow as well. But remember for today that food flows through phloem. So what's the other type of vascular tissue? It is called xylem. Look at the word. It starts with an X, just like the word xylophone. Maybe you've played around with a xylophone in music class. Well, this word is pronounced like a Z, xylem. Xylem. Everybody look at the word and say xylem. Well, what does xylem do? Xylem transports water and minerals. And now here's a difference between xylem and phloem. You see, phloem, food flows through phloem both up and down in a plant. But xylem only transports upward. You see, xylem is found mostly in roots of plants. And as a plant is growing and the roots are spreading out, the cellular structure of the roots is very dense and has very thick walls and is made out of a lot of xylem, because the water and the minerals that are found in the soil are transported upward through the xylem. Incidentally, there's a lot of xylem in the stems of plants as well, because, as you can imagine, these thick walls provide a lot of support and structure to the stem of a vascular land plant. So typically, vascular land plants can grow a lot taller than, not even typically, always. Vascular land plants are going to have the ability to grow much taller and larger than non-vascular land plants, and certainly more than primitive plants. So here are the 2 types of vascular tissue for today, and the 2 types of land plants. We have the non-vascular, which doesn't have a system of tiny tubes, and the vascular land plants. And the 2 types of vascular land plants, phloem and xylem. And I want to finish today with a question to you. What flows through phloem? See you later.